You sure that's legal? The young officer tilted her head as she stepped out of the patrol car, a smirk playing on her lips. Her mirrored sunglasses reflected the image of a man who hadn't moved an inch. He was seated on a worn, growling motorcycle, one hand resting lightly on the throttle, the other on the brake. He didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Elliot Granger was 81 years old. And if there's one thing he'd learned in those years, it was this: silence can say more than shouting ever could. That morning had started like every other. Granger woke with the sun. At 5 a.m., the rooster didn't wake him. He woke the rooster. Coffee, black. Oatmeal, plain. One glance out the window over his Wyoming cattle ranch, then he was off. His green 1978 John Deere tractor had finally died for good the day before, so he dusted off the one machine that never failed him, a 1971 Harley-Davidson FLH, painted flat black and loud as thunder. It wasn't pretty. It didn't need to be. He didn't ride for style. He rode for function, for freedom, for the feeling of movement through an unmoving world. It was how he got to town. How he got parts. How he got peace. And that's where it all began, at the red light on 3rd and Main, just outside of Danvers, a sleepy High Plains town where people still knew your name unless they were new to the badge. The squad car pulled up behind him. Lights flashed. Siren gave a short warning chirp. Then came Officer Lila Monroe, 29, 3 years into the force, walking with all the confidence of someone who'd never been punched by the world. License and registration, she barked, hand resting near her holster. And I need you off that bike now. Granger stayed seated. He turned his head just enough to meet her gaze. No fear. No defiance. Just stillness, like a mountain looking back at the wind. Another officer stepped out. Paul Renshaw, rookie, cocky, laughed a little too loud. This bike's a rust bucket, he muttered. Guy's gotta be pushing 90. Granger opened the worn leather wallet clipped to his belt and handed over his papers. No words. Just compliance. Monroe frowned. 81. That right? He nodded. Don't you think that's a little old to be riding a motorcycle? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. That silence unsettled her. Because authority feeds on resistance, but when there's none, it feels like standing on a wire with no tension. She looked at him again, trying to read him. But Elliot Granger didn't give away anything for free. Behind them, traffic slowed. A few pedestrians stopped. Cameras came out. Whispers began. Is that old man okay? Should he be riding that thing? Maybe he's confused. But Monroe didn't back down. Not yet. Not until everything she thought she knew was flipped on its head. Because in less than 20 minutes, a convoy was coming. And when it arrived, nothing in that town, not even the badge on her chest, would hold the same weight. Officer Lila Monroe's tone sharpened as the seconds ticked by. Sir, I need you to step off the motorcycle now. But Elliot Granger didn't budge. He sat there like a monument to a forgotten time, spine straight, boots steady on the pavement, breath slow and controlled. Behind the mirrored lenses of Officer Monroe's sunglasses, her irritation flickered into confusion. Why wasn't he arguing? Why wasn't he nervous? Why did the air around this man feel wrong? Officer Paul Renshaw took a few steps forward and leaned toward the bike. Check this thing out. It's a miracle it still runs. He tapped the leather saddlebag with a gloved finger. Guy probably thinks he's still living in the 70s. Granger handed over his registration and license with the calmness of a man handing out playing cards. His fingers were steady, his face unreadable. The wallet he pulled from was weathered, brown leather cracked from decades of use, but the ID inside was clean, organized, recent. Monroe squinted at the license. 81. Ha. She looked him up and down. Sir, do you live nearby? Granger's voice came low, like distant thunder. 10 miles west. Just off County Road 14. Cattle Ranch. Alone? Monroe pressed. Granger nodded. Since my wife passed. Renshaw glanced at Monroe. No kids? Granger didn't respond. The weight of that silence fell over the scene like a tarp. The officers exchanged a glance, half skepticism, half discomfort. Monroe shifted on her feet. You know, sir, she said, it might not be safe for someone your age to be out here alone. Riding something like this. Granger remained silent. His gaze never wavered. Pedestrians began to gather on the sidewalks. A teenage girl in a hoodie pulled out her phone and hit record. A father with his young son paused at the corner. A couple in their 70s stopped mid-walk and whispered to each other. What's going on? Someone asked. Did the old guy do something? He looks, kind of out of it, another murmured. Renshaw stepped forward again. Sir, I'm going to need you to stand with your hands behind your back. Standard procedure. Standard for what? Granger asked, still calm. Renshaw didn't answer. He just nudged his sunglasses higher and began patting down the side of the Harley. A voice cut through the murmurs. That's enough. Everyone turned to see Marcus Reed standing across the street. The gas station owner, a Gulf War vet, still wore the grease-stained overalls he always had. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't need to. He simply stared across the intersection at the scene unfolding before him. He knew that bike. He knew the man who rode it. Every Friday for 15 years, Elliot Granger had pulled into his station, nodded hello, paid cash, and disappeared with no drama. Always polite. Always precise. And now he was being treated like a potential criminal, for what? Being old. Owning a motorcycle. Reed's jaw clenched. He stepped inside the gas station, grabbed the landline, and dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade. Fort Granite, came the voice on the other end. Staff Sergeant Tanner speaking. This is Marcus Reed, civilian. I need to speak with someone in charge. Urgently. What's the situation? There's a man being detained here in Danvers, Elliot Granger. He's being hassled by local police. He's a veteran. A good one. There was a pause. Did you say Elliot Granger? Yeah. Another pause. Then the tone changed. Sir, please stay on the line. Do not let anything happen to him. We're dispatching a team now. Can you confirm his location? Yes. Corner of 3rd and Main. Right in front of my gas station. The line went dead for a moment before the voice returned, firmer this time. Mr. Reed, keep eyes on him. Don't let them move him. Do not intervene directly. Backup is en route. Reed stared out the window. Monroe was now speaking louder. Sir, I'm going to ask one more time. Get off the motorcycle. We can have a doctor check you out, just to be safe. Granger's answer was almost a whisper. No, Monroe blinked. Excuse me. I said no. I'm not going. She stepped forward, her stance more aggressive now. Sir, you don't have a choice in this. We're acting in your best interest. Granger's lips curled into a dry smile. That's what they always say right before they take your freedom. Phones captured every second. The whispers turned to mutters. Some sided with the officers. Others with the old man. But none of them, not even Monroe, knew what was coming. 12 miles down the road, dust was already rising. Inside the small control room at Fort Granite, Staff Sergeant Tanner lowered the receiver slowly, eyes narrowing. His hand hovered over the red button on the comms panel. A call like that, coming from a civilian, a fellow veteran, claiming someone named Elliot Granger was being disrespected on the streets? It could have been a mistake. A misunderstanding. But the name, it rang too loud to ignore. He turned to the officer seated behind a desk stacked with personnel files and field reports. "Lieutenant," Tanner said. "I think we've got a situation." Lieutenant Jamie Linwood raised a brow. "Talk to me." "Guy named Marcus Reed called. Says a man named Elliot Granger is being harassed by local police in Danvers. Says he's a vet." Linwood froze, then slowly set down her coffee. "Did you say Granger?" "Yeah." She pushed her chair back and went straight to the filing cabinet. After a few seconds of frantic rifling, she pulled out a thick, olive-drab folder. "Colonel Elliot A. Granger. 3 tours, Vietnam, Gulf, Afghanistan. Retired in '98. Taught survival and recon at Fort Granite for a decade after that. Decorated to hell and back. 2 Bronze Stars. Purple Hearts. Distinguished Service Cross. Trained half the field-grade officers we've got in this region." Tanner whistled. "And he's being harassed?" "In public," Linwood said. "By rookies, probably." Within minutes, the alert went out. A QRF, Quick Reaction Force, was assembled. 12 Humvees. 50 soldiers. No weapons drawn, but every man and woman in uniform had been briefed. This wasn't a mission. It was a message. Captain Nolan Hayes took command of the operation. A tall man in his mid-50s, Hayes had earned his stripes through sweat and silence. He wasn't a yeller. He wasn't a showman. But when he walked into the room, people stood straighter. "Colonel Granger," he said, reading the name aloud as he received the mission brief. "I know that name." He looked out over the troops, already filing into vehicles. His voice rose just enough. "Colonel Granger taught me how to survive in the desert. He taught me how to command with clarity. He trained most of us. And now, we're going to remind a town that legends don't wear capes, they wear dust, leather, and history." Back in Danvers, Officer Monroe's stance had grown more rigid. She paced now. Frustration mounting. She'd asked the old man politely. Then she'd given him a lawful command. And still, he refused to move. "You're not leaving me many options," she said through clenched teeth. "Sir, for your safety and the safety of others, I'm placing you under temporary detainment." Granger looked at her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of steel behind his calm eyes. "Based on what?" he asked. Monroe hesitated. There was no formal charge. No probable cause. Just, a gut feeling. An instinct built more on prejudice than procedure. Renshaw whispered beside her, "Maybe we should call it in." "No," Monroe said too quickly. "We've got this under control." Across the street, Marcus Reed was still on the phone with Fort Granite's comms desk. He gave precise updates. "They're still holding him. Officer Monroe is escalating. I don't like the way this looks. ETA on our unit is 12 minutes, came the reply. Hold the line. More townspeople had gathered. Some filming. Some shouting. Some just watching with growing discomfort. He didn't do anything, one woman called. Let the man ride, another yelled. The tension was thicker than the summer heat. Granger stood now, finally off the bike, hands loosely behind his back. He wasn't surrendering. He was waiting. 10 minutes later, on the outskirts of town, the dust cloud crested the hill. A boy riding his bicycle stopped and stared, mouth agape. The roar of engines, deep, steady, coordinated, echoed across the open plains. A dozen Humvees, their paint sun-faded but proud, moved in a tight column. At the front, Captain Hayes stood through the roof hatch, scanning the horizon. They passed hayfields, gas pumps, rusted signs, and finally turned down Main Street. Danvers stopped breathing. The convoy moved like a wave of consequence. Like history reclaiming its voice. When the lead vehicle turned onto 3rd and Main, Officer Monroe instinctively stepped back. The Humvees formed a semicircle around the scene. Doors opened. Boots hit pavement. In perfect, unified motion, 50 soldiers stood at ease but alert. The crowd parted like water. Captain Hayes walked forward alone. He stopped 3 feet from Granger, raised his hand, and saluted. A full, proper military salute that seemed to freeze the world. "Colonel Granger, sir." Monroe's lips parted. Renshaw's face paled. Granger nodded. "Captain Hayes. I heard there was a misunderstanding." Hayes turned, and for the first time addressed the officers. His voice was level but sharp as a blade. "Who ordered the detainment of Colonel Granger?" Monroe stepped forward, swallowing hard. I did, sir." "I wasn't aware, you weren't aware of the man you were detaining?" Hayes cut in. "No, sir. This man," Hayes said, pointing without looking, "has more years serving this nation than you've had birthdays. He carried intel through combat zones, saved lives with his bare hands, and trained the very command structure that keeps your state safe. And you thought his motorcycle made him a threat?" "I didn't mean, you meant to assume," Hayes replied coldly. "And you did." The soldiers behind him took a synchronized step forward. The crowd gasped. Cameras rolled. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," Hayes continued. "But what happened here is a lesson in what not to do. Disrespect has a cost." He turned back to Granger. "Sir, do you require assistance? Escort? Medical care?" Granger shook his head. "No, Captain. Just came into town for a part." Hayes nodded. "Understood. But know this, Fort Granite stands with you. Always." Granger stepped toward his Harley. Monroe tried to speak, but no words came. Hayes looked back at her one final time. "Officer Monroe, consider this your first and last reminder, never judge a person by their appearance. Especially when their silence hides 1,000 untold stories." The silence after Captain Hayes's words was complete, more piercing than any siren, heavier than the summer heat that hung over the street. Officer Monroe stood frozen, her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound escaped. Her partner, Officer Renshaw, looked like he wanted to disappear into the asphalt. Colonel Elliot Granger swung his leg over the Harley and stood tall. The crowd, once uncertain and divided, now stood unified in awe and shame. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the wind had stilled, as if honoring the quiet dignity of the man at the center of it all. "I believe," Captain Hayes said calmly, "that Colonel Granger has somewhere to be." The soldiers stepped aside, forming a corridor down the street, boots aligned in solemn respect. Granger nodded once, pulled his gloves from his back pocket, and mounted the bike. With a twist of the key, the Harley rumbled to life, echoing down Main Street like rolling thunder. And then, like a general leading a procession, he rode. At the Danvers Police Department, the fallout was immediate. Sheriff Wallace Green, a man not known for his temper, paced behind his desk. The phone call had come minutes after the convoy left Fort Granite's command office, making clear the magnitude of what had just occurred. "You understand this wasn't just about one officer's judgment," the base commander had said. "It was about the trust between our institutions. That trust was broken today." Wallace had listened in silence, nodding where needed. Now, standing in front of the assembled department, he let out a heavy sigh. "Effective immediately," he said, "all field officers will undergo a new protocol for senior citizen encounters, and all of you will attend a mandatory training course at Fort Granite next week. This isn't negotiable." Murmurs rippled through the room. Officer Monroe sat stiffly, cheeks flushed, eyes downcast. "I know some of you think this is unfair," Green continued. "But this isn't about fairness. It's about learning. And about never making someone like Colonel Granger feel less than what they are." He paused. A damn national treasure. The next day, Monroe stood alone outside the precinct, clutching a manila folder in her hand. It contained her written apology, one she wasn't ordered to write. She stared at the sky, uncertain, then climbed into her cruiser. The ride out to County Road 14 was long and quiet. The radio stayed off. She wasn't sure what she'd say. But she knew she had to go. Granger's farmhouse sat quiet and proud, white paint aging gracefully under the sun. The porch sagged slightly, and wind chimes rang gently in the breeze. The Harley rested in the shade of a maple tree, its frame glinting with the stubborn shine of something that refused to be forgotten. She found him under a tractor, arms deep in hydraulics. She cleared her throat. "Colonel Granger." He slid out slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Officer Monroe. I came to talk." He gestured toward the porch. "Coffee's fresh." Inside the kitchen, it was simple. Ceramic mugs, a pot still warm, and the aroma of earth and beans. Monroe sat across from him, nerves twisting like wire. "Why'd you become a cop?" Granger asked after a long silence. She blinked. I wanted to help people. Make things better." He sipped. "And how many senior drivers have you seen cause accidents?" "Honestly," she said. "Not many. The worst ones are usually younger. Texting. Drinking. Speeding." Granger nodded slowly. "Then why'd you assume I was the risk?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. "You know," he said, standing to refill his mug, "in the jungle, the quiet ones were the deadliest. Not because they were sneaky, but because they were watching. Listening. Waiting." He looked at her, not unkindly. "Sometimes, what looks like weakness is discipline. Stillness. Strength that's been tested in places most people wouldn't survive." Monroe's voice cracked. "I made a mistake." Granger smiled gently. "Yes. But now you're here. That's how you fix mistakes." The story didn't end with Granger's ride or Monroe's visit. The footage from that day spread like wildfire. Local stations picked it up. Then regional outlets. Then national media. "Colonel on a Harley" trended for 2 days. People across the country were suddenly talking about respect. About aging. About the stories we ignore because they come in wrinkled skin and rusted engines. Veterans reached out from across the states. Letters came. Gifts. A veteran biker club offered to refurbish the Harley. Granger declined with a chuckle. "It's just fine as it is." The Danvers PD quietly rewrote its handbook. Officer Monroe, humbled and changed, led the first session of the new training, standing in front of a projector screen and telling the story, not just of her error, but of her growth. And on Saturdays, sometimes, she'd drive out to County Road 14. Just to talk. Just to listen. Because now she understood, dignity isn't something given. It's something recognized. And Elliot Granger, even in silence, demanded it. It was nearly a month after the incident in Danvers when the invitation came. Hand-delivered by a uniformed sergeant from Fort Granite, the envelope bore the military crest and a single line in bold at the top, "Guest of Honor, Colonel Elliot Granger." Inside was a formal invitation to the base's annual Honor Day. A tradition held every summer to recognize exemplary service members, living and fallen. Granger hadn't attended in years. Not out of bitterness, but because the world had shifted. The faces had changed. The uniforms, even the war stories, no longer felt like his. This year, that changed. Granger stood in front of his mirror, straightening the creases in his old dress blues. The medals glinted faintly beneath the low light of his bedroom. He didn't need them for recognition. He never had. But today wasn't about needing. It was about showing up. And between boot-polished shoes and solemn plaques. The moment Colonel Elliot Granger arrived on his Harley, a hush swept the area. He rode slowly, deliberately, his boots hitting the asphalt with careful precision as he parked just outside the review stand. Captain Nolan Hayes was already waiting, flanked by a color guard and a group of senior officers. "Colonel Granger," Hayes said, saluting. "Welcome back, sir." Granger returned the gesture, his eyes scanning the grounds. "Didn't think I'd be back here again." Hayes smiled. "We didn't think we'd have the honor." The ceremony began. Speeches were made. Flags were raised. Stories of valor and sacrifice echoed through the PA system, but it wasn't until the final speaker stepped forward that the real silence fell. It was Officer Lila Monroe. Dressed in her Danvers police uniform, crisp and clean, she stood behind the podium and faced the crowd. "Last month, I made a mistake," she began. "A mistake born from assumption and a failure to ask questions before taking action. I thought I saw just an old man on a motorcycle. What I didn't see was the legacy, the sacrifice, the dignity." She glanced toward Granger, seated in the front row beside Hayes. "But that moment changed me. It reminded me what service looks like, and how often we ignore it because we don't recognize it." She paused. "I stand here today to say thank you, not just to Colonel Granger, but to every quiet hero we've overlooked." The applause that followed was quiet at first, then surged like a wave. Not the rowdy kind. The reverent kind. Granger simply nodded once, his eyes misted. Later that afternoon, beneath a canvas tent on the outskirts of the base, Granger sat at a long table with Hayes, Monroe, Marcus Reed, and a few young recruits. "I don't understand," one of the recruits said, "how you didn't yell or fight back when they tried to arrest you." Granger chuckled. "I've been in places where yelling gets you killed. Discipline isn't silence. It's choosing your moment." Monroe leaned in. "And sometimes your silence says more than any shouting could." Hayes raised his glass of iced tea. "To Colonel Granger. For teaching us all what presence really means." "To Granger," they echoed. 2 weeks later, a new training module was launched across the state, Field Encounters with Dignity. The video opened with dashcam footage from that day in Danvers, followed by Monroe's voice narrating what she'd learned. Granger refused to be interviewed, but his presence in the film, silent, calm, steady, carried more weight than words ever could. And every so often, when a rookie asked about what happened to the colonel on the Harley, the veterans at Fort Granite would smile. "Still out there," they'd say. Fort Granite's parade ground was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched beneath the sun, flanked by flag-lined pathways and shaded tents. Families, veterans, cadets, and officers gathered, chatting and sipping lemonade while children are still riding. Still teaching. Still reminding the world that the quiet ones often carry the loudest legacies. In a world that moves faster every day, we often forget to slow down and truly see each other. The last ride of Colonel Granger reminds us that dignity doesn't come from medals or uniforms, it comes from how we carry ourselves when no one's watching. Sometimes, the people we overlook, the quiet ones, the elders, the seemingly ordinary, are the very ones who carry the deepest stories and the strongest character. Respect isn't just about following rules, it's about listening before judging, asking before assuming, and remembering that wisdom often arrives wrapped in silence. Colonel Granger never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His stillness was his strength. And in that stillness, he taught an entire town, and maybe all of us, what real presence, humility, and honor look like. If this story moved you or made you think differently, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories like this to life. Thank you for watching, and never forget to look beyond the surface. The quiet ones just might be the heroes among us.